13 November 1942, 22:41 hours, Iron Bottom Sound. The night pressed down on the Pacific like a sheet of black iron, the moon smothered behind low clouds, the sea a restless mass of dark water split only by distant flashes of gunfire. USS Enterprise, bruised, patched, and still carrying the scars of Santa Cruz, moved steadily southward, her decks trembling under the deep throb of engines forced far beyond their intended rhythm. She was, for this one night, the last functioning American carrier in the Pacific. Her sisters were sunk, burning, or months away in repair docks. Only she remained, a lone steel island with a damaged flight deck and a tired crew, listening to the dying echoes of a battle she could not see, yet could feel in every vibration of the hull. The atmosphere aboard was unlike anything the crew had experienced in months of combat. No aircraft roared off her deck, no searchlights swept the sky. Instead, there was a deeper, more primitive tension, the sound of distant explosions rolling across the water, the faint silhouette of burning ships on the horizon, and the metallic scent of cordite carried by the night wind. Sailors moved along the catwalks in hushed motions, tools clinking softly, helmets strapped tight. The general quarters alarm had long since become background noise, a constant reminder that any moment could be their last. In the Combat Information Center, Lieutenant Commander Nathan Hale, a veteran of Coral Sea, Midway, and Santa Cruz, stood with one hand braced on the chart table, listening to frantic radio fragments from the destroyers off Savo Island. Hale's face, illuminated only by the dim red lights of the plotting boards, reflected a tension held rigid beneath practiced composure. Reports came in broken bursts, a cruiser exploding, a destroyer taking torpedoes, and the sky above Guadalcanal lit by muzzle flashes from Japanese battleships that had slipped through the darkness like ghosts. The ship around him groaned with every sudden course correction. Damage control teams remained stationed in the hangar deck's shadowed corners, gloves on, hoses coiled, ready for fire to erupt without warning. Even the veterans sensed something shifting in the air, a heaviness, the weight of an unseen enemy creeping closer. Hale could smell the faint burn of oil drifting from the east. He knew what that meant. Another U.S. ship was dying out there. Far off in the blackness, the thunder of naval guns rose again, deeper, slower, unmistakable. Battleship guns. The Japanese had brought their heavy ships forward, and the American screening force was buckling under their weight. Hale leaned closer to the radio, jaw tightening as a voice crackled through interference, shouting coordinates before dissolving into static. Somewhere in that darkness, men he knew were fighting at impossible odds, and Enterprise, crippled but still afloat, was the only carrier left to launch airstrikes at first light. A cold realization settled over him like condensation on steel. If the night ended badly, if the sound of those heavy guns crept too close, Enterprise herself might become the next ghost of Iron Bottom Sound. And yet the worst moment of the night hadn't come. Not yet.
Lieutenant Commander Nathan Hale had learned long ago that war did not reward brilliance as much as endurance. At 35, with a weathered face deeply lined by salt air and sleepless nights, he had become the quiet backbone of Enterprise's Combat Information Center. Hale was not one of those officers whose names appeared in newspapers or whose faces were used to boost morale back home. He was the kind of man who kept a ship alive by making the right decisions in moments when no one else could make them fast enough. He had joined the Navy as a radio technician, worked his way through flight school, then transferred to carrier operations when an injury grounded him. That twist of fate had placed him exactly where the Pacific War now needed him most. His hands, large and scarred from years of repairing equipment in cramped compartments, traced the edges of navigation charts with compulsive precision. He remembered each coastline, each island contour, each reef from months of plotting strike operations across the Solomons. Men trusted him because he understood the ocean like a living organism, its moods, its silence, its deceptive calm. More importantly, he understood people. He sensed fear before he saw it, recognized hesitation in voices, knew when to push and when to hold back. Tonight, as the walls of the CIC shuddered with distant explosions, Hale felt both the weight of responsibility and the fragility of the men around him. His crew had been awake for nearly 40 hours. Some had dark oil stains on their faces from repairing cables in the bowels of the ship. Others carried bandages beneath their uniforms, ignoring burns or shrapnel cuts. Hale saw exhaustion in their eyes, but also determination, the stubborn refusal to be the generation that lost the Pacific. The younger sailors watched him more closely tonight. They needed a steady presence, someone who could make the terror outside feel manageable. Hale knew this instinctively and held himself with a stillness he did not feel. Despite his collected exterior, his thoughts drifted. He remembered the men they had lost in previous battles, pilots who had taken off from Enterprise and never returned. He remembered retrieving dog tags from wreckage on the hangar deck after Santa Cruz, the metal still warm from fire. He remembered writing letters to families, choosing words carefully so that grief would break them gently, not violently. He carried those memories like silent weight in the pockets of his uniform. Yet it wasn't grief that haunted him most, it was uncertainty. The Japanese had proven again and again that they could strike with lethal precision under cover of night. And now, with Enterprise battered and nearly alone, Hale knew they were vulnerable. The ship's radar arrays were functioning but limited. The starboard elevator was damaged. Several compartments remained patched with temporary welds. They could take one more hit, maybe two, but another full attack like Santa Cruz would tear the ship open. Still, Hale forced his breathing steady. He adjusted his headset, leaned over the plotting board, and continued issuing orders with a calm that seemed carved out of steel. He believed deeply in the ship and the men who kept her alive. He believed in their stubborn resilience, forged through fire and months of brutal fighting. He believed that Enterprise, though wounded, still had a role to play in this war, perhaps the most important role yet. But a shadow moved through Hale's mind, an instinct he trusted more than any radar echo. Something large, too large, was maneuvering in the darkness near Guadalcanal, something that no charts could predict. And he knew that before the night ended, he would be forced to confront it.
The night of 13 November 1942 did not erupt from nowhere. It was the culmination of months in which the Pacific War balanced on the knife's edge, and USS Enterprise had been thrust into the center of a struggle America could not afford to lose. Ever since the opening shots of the Guadalcanal campaign in August, the Solomons had devoured ships, aircraft, and men with a hunger that stunned even veteran officers. The Japanese considered the island chain their natural defensive perimeter, a place from which they could sever the lifeline between the U.S. and Australia. The Americans understood that if Guadalcanal fell, every future operation in the Pacific would be overshadowed by Japanese airfields capable of striking deep into Allied supply routes. Thus, the battle became a grinding war of attrition, fought across jungles, reefs, and the narrow channels the sailors came to call Iron Bottom Sound. By October, that attrition had nearly stripped the U.S. Navy of its carriers. The Wasp had been torpedoed and sunk. The Hornet had gone down fighting at Santa Cruz. The Saratoga was out of action after another torpedo strike. The Enterprise herself had taken bomb hits that tore through decks, killed men in seconds, and forced crews to weld together damaged compartments while underway. Yet she returned to the front repeatedly, limping but unbroken, receiving pilot and aircraft from land-based squadrons just to keep her flight deck operational. The Japanese, meanwhile, rotated their carriers and battleships with relentless determination, believing they could crush the American lodgment on Guadalcanal through a sustained series of surface bombardments and reinforcement convoys. Strategic conditions deteriorated rapidly in early November. Japan prepared its largest attempt yet to retake the island, assembling a force of transports carrying nearly 10,000 troops, enough to overwhelm the battered Marines holding Henderson Field. Covering those transports were battleships Hiei and Kirishima, cruisers and destroyers, trained in night fighting under doctrines that favored sudden, devastating assaults. The Americans had radar, but radar alone could not compensate for the lack of experienced night action crews. As the Japanese force pushed southward, Enterprise was still repairing damage sustained during the previous weeks. Entire sections of her flight deck remained scorched. Her aviation fuel lines had been patched with temporary fittings. The ship had not been fully ready for battle, but she was the only carrier left. Hale watched the situation unfold with the cold understanding of a man who had studied both enemy doctrine and the thin margins holding the American position together. Every report from Guadalcanal painted the same picture. U.S. cruisers were being outmaneuvered. Destroyers were being torn apart by accurate Japanese torpedoes, and the night sky showed intermittent flashes indicating that the bombardment force had already begun engaging the surviving defenders around Savo Island. If Japan succeeded in landing those troops, no amount of courage from the Marines would save the island. Henderson Field would fall, the airfield would go dark, and the Pacific would tilt decisively in Japan's favor. The responsibility placed upon Enterprise was almost unbearable in its simplicity. She had to survive the night. She had to be ready at dawn to launch scouting flights, dive bombers, and torpedo planes capable of striking the transports before they reached Guadalcanal's shores. If she was sunk or disabled before daybreak, the Japanese would land unopposed. It was a truth Hale felt pressing against his ribs like a physical weight. Never in his career had a single ship carried so much on its scarred hull. And somewhere in the darkness, guided by spotlights and the glow of burning American ships, the Japanese battleships were drawing closer. Their guns, each barrel capable of turning a cruiser into molten debris with a single salvo, were searching for their next target. And if the night continued to unravel, Enterprise might become that target.
Lieutenant Commander Hale stood with his palms braced against the edge of the plotting table, the soft red glow of the CIC lamps casting long shadows across the faces of the men around him. The reports arriving through static-filled radio channels painted a picture more terrifying than any single radar sweep could show. The Japanese bombardment force, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers had surged into Iron Bottom Sound with ruthless coordination. American cruisers were taking hits at point-blank ranges. Destroyers were burning bow to stern. The night seemed alive with the low thunder of naval gunfire echoing across the water like distant earthquakes. And Enterprise, wounded and exposed, lay only a few dozen miles away from the unfolding disaster. The ship's vulnerabilities pressed on Hale's mind with grim clarity. The forward elevator was still jammed from the Santa Cruz hit. It had been patched with steel bracing, but the lift could seize again under stress. Several compartments in the lower decks, hastily welded, were not watertight and would not survive a torpedo strike. The air group was reduced, many aircraft held together by temporary repairs. Even the ship's internal arteries, fuel lines, hydraulic conduits, electrical systems still bore the scars of recent battle damage, repairs that only thinly shielded them from catastrophic failure. A single penetrative hit in the wrong section could flood the engineering spaces, sever power, or ignite aviation fuel in the hangar. What frightened Hale most, however, was the nature of the enemy approaching through the darkness. Japanese night-surviving doctrine was built around aggression and precision. Their long-lance torpedoes outranged anything the Americans carried and ran nearly silent, leaving no warning until impact. Their battleships, particularly Kirishima, maneuvered with a speed the U.S. officers still found difficult to believe for ships of such size. And tonight, the Japanese gunners had the advantage of illumination. Burning American ships cast flickering light on the water, betraying silhouettes in an environment that should have hidden them. Hale could imagine how it looked aboard those Japanese vessels, spotters shouting bearings, torpedo officers calculating spreads, the sudden white flash of a main battery salvo punching into the night. He knew what those shells could do. At Santa Cruz, he had watched from the hangar deck as armor-piercing bombs punched through 3 layers of plating and detonated deep within the ship. If a battleship shell struck Enterprise tonight, no amount of damage control would save her. Radar operators whispered to each other as their scopes danced with interference, struggling to track contacts through the chaotic reflections of landmasses and burning wrecks. The CIC felt like a pressure chamber. Every man sensed the same terrible possibility. The Japanese might break through the battered American screen and find Enterprise alone on the water, unable to outrun battleships that could tear her open from 10 miles away. Hale checked the chart again. Their position placed them dangerously close to the axis of the Japanese advance. One wrong maneuver, one erroneous report, and the ship might drift into the path of Kirishima's searching gunners. And the carriers of the Pacific were never designed to fight battleships in the dark. They were creatures of daylight and flight operations, not nighttime duels of armor and steel. His mind ran through every scenario. If the Japanese closed the range, Enterprise had no choice but evasive maneuvering. But the damaged rudder linkage had been temperamental, its reliability questionable. If they were forced to launch night planes, the chances of losing pilots were almost certain. If a torpedo hit their starboard side, the patched compartments would rupture instantly. The truth sank into Hale with the heaviness of deep water. The ship was balanced between survival and annihilation. And the enemy, emboldened by victory elsewhere in the Sound, was drawing closer with each echoing thud of artillery. Somewhere in that darkness, a moment was approaching, the moment when Enterprise would either vanish beneath the black waves or rise again at dawn to strike back.
The night deepened into a suffocating void, the kind of darkness that swallowed all sense of distance, direction, and time. To Hale, it felt as if the entire Pacific had narrowed to the trembling steel beneath his boots and the faint, flickering signals on the radar screens. Then, at 23:17, a tremor ran through the deck, not from Enterprise's engines, but from something far away yet impossibly powerful. A second later, it came again, a deeper, slower vibration that made every man in the CIC lift his head. Battleship guns. The Japanese were firing at point-blank range, and the violent, rolling echoes spreading across Iron Bottom Sound meant only one thing. Another American ship was dying. A voice burst through the radio, panicked and raw. "This is Atlanta. Multiple hits. Turrets gone. We're—" Static swallowed the transmission. Hale clenched his jaw. Atlanta was out there fighting alone, her decks already lit by fire from her own superstructure. The Japanese formation was carving straight through the American screen, and with each passing minute, they were closing the gap between themselves and Enterprise. The bridge sent an urgent request to the CIC: prepare for evasive maneuvering. Hale relayed bearings, correcting for drift, watching the ship respond sluggishly as the damaged steering system strained to obey. The carrier heeled slightly, leaving a subtle wake that glittered faintly where distant flames reflected across the water. That glow, that terrible glow, made Hale's stomach tighten. It was a beacon. Any Japanese spotter searching the horizon would see it. "Lieutenant, contact! Large, closing fast." The radar operator spoke in a whisper, eyes fixed on the scope. A heavy displacement return pulsed on the screen. Hale moved closer. It was too large for a cruiser, too swift for a transport. He felt the conclusion form like ice in his chest. Kirishima. The Japanese battleship was moving through the night with deliberate precision, hunting for the American carrier it suspected still lingered somewhere beyond the burning wreckage of the cruiser screen. Hale could almost picture the scene aboard her. Officers leaning over plotting tables, torpedo crews preparing spreads, gunners adjusting elevation for long-range fire. Enterprise was their prize. A shudder ran through the carrier as she increased speed to her maximum safe limit, her engines protesting with a deep, metallic rumble. Damage control teams braced themselves in the hangar deck, gripping hoses, axes, and extinguishers, all too aware that their odds of surviving a direct hit were painfully small. The air was thick with the smell of oil and hot metal. A faint haze of smoke from distant burning ships drifted across the deck like a dark ghost. On the flight deck, illuminated only by blue deck lamps, crews worked in silence around the few aircraft Hale had ordered armed for an emergency night launch. Pilots climbed into their cockpits with tense, unreadable expressions. Night takeoffs from a damaged carrier in unstable seas were a gamble with death. But Hale knew they might be the only way to reveal the Japanese fleet's position before dawn. Then, suddenly, the sea to the north flared white. A column of water exploded upward, illuminated by fire. A battleship salvo impacting near the last surviving U.S. destroyer. Another barrage followed, staggered like drumbeats. The Japanese were continuing their advance, unaware exactly where Enterprise lay, but close enough that any change in wind or reflection could betray her. The CIC fell into absolute stillness, the kind that preceded catastrophe or salvation. Hale's pulse thudded in his ears as he watched the radar sweep rotate, tracing the movement of the enemy formation. The bearing lines converged, the echoes grew stronger, the distance shrank. And then, in the midst of tension so thick it felt physical, a new signal appeared at the edge of the scope. Faint, but unmistakable. American reinforcements. A small group of destroyers racing toward Iron Bottom Sound from the south, engines pushed to the limit, determined to intercept the Japanese before they could reach Enterprise. Hale exhaled slowly, hands still trembling. But as the distant gunfire intensified once again, he knew the battle's turning point was still ahead, and dawn was approaching far too slowly. When dawn finally bled across the horizon on 14 November 1942, the light revealed a sea transformed into a graveyard. Smoke drifted low over the water like a torn shroud. Broken masts protruded from the surface at unnatural angles, and the silhouettes of shattered cruisers lay half-sunk, their hulls buckled as if crushed by an invisible fist. To Hale, standing on the starboard catwalk with the wind cutting cold against his face, the sight was both devastating and galvanizing. The night had been a slaughter, but Enterprise had lived. And because she lived, the fight for Guadalcanal was not lost. Word filtered through the ship in fragments. The Atlanta was gone. The Juneau, carrying the Sullivan brothers, had been torn apart in a single explosion. The Sterett, Monsen, and other destroyers were burning or sunk. But the Japanese losses were brutal as well. Hiei lay crippled, unable to escape the air attacks that would soon finish her. The bombardment that was meant to wipe Henderson Field from the island had failed. The Marines were still holding. Hale returned to the CIC as flight operations prepared to resume at first light. The atmosphere inside the compartment was transformed, not jubilant, never that, but sharpened. The men understood what the survivors of the night had bought with their blood. A fleeting window of initiative. Now Enterprise had to strike hard enough to shatter the Japanese reinforcement plan before it could regain its footing. He watched the flight deck through the narrow CIC porthole as the first Dauntlesses crept forward, their wings glistening under the golden morning light. Many of the pilots launching were veterans. Some had flown through storms, fires, bomb hits, and crippling losses since the opening weeks of the war. Others were replacements who had arrived with barely a week of experience operating from a carrier under combat conditions. Yet they climbed into their cockpits without hesitation,
adjusting oxygen masks, checking guns, running through emergency procedures. Every man aboard knew what was at stake. The crackle of the intercom brought Hale back to the plotting table. Enemy transport group sighted, multiple vessels, estimated 10,000 troops aboard. The voice paused. Fighter escort minimal. They're exposed. It was the moment Hale had been waiting for, the moment that justified surviving the night. He relayed new coordinates to the strike leaders, marking the approach lines with a steady hand. Within minutes, Enterprise's air group was airborne, engines roaring as they climbed into the sky. As they banked away toward Guadalcanal, sunlight flashed across their fuselages like sparks scattering from steel. Through the day, reports returned in steady waves. Bombs finding their marks, transports erupting into flame, troop-packed ships listing heavily as smoke poured from their holds. Hale listened to each message with measured calm, but inside, he felt something almost like relief. Every transport destroyed meant fewer men reaching the beaches, fewer bullets fired at the Marines, fewer nights like the one just passed. By late afternoon, the Japanese reinforcement convoy was shattered. Many transports burned to the waterline. Others turned back in desperation. The threat that had loomed for weeks, a massive, overwhelming landing, was broken. When Hale finally stepped onto the flight deck again, the sun was dipping low, turning the waves to strips of gold and crimson. He watched returning aircraft circle and land one by one, their tires skidding across the scarred deck, their wings rattling from bullet holes and explosive shock. Each safe landing was a silent triumph, another pilot alive, another thread of hope preserved. Only then, in that fragile calm, did Hale allow himself to feel the full weight of what Enterprise had endured. She had fought through Coral Sea, Midway, Eastern Solomons, Santa Cruz. She had survived bombs that should have torn her apart, fires that should have gutted her, nights that should have ended her. And now, here in the Solomons, she had carried the Pacific on her back once more, alone, battered, but unbowed. Years later, long after new carriers eclipsed her in size and power, after the war ended and the world changed, Hale would remember that night not for its terror, but for its clarity. The moment when the fate of a vast ocean hinged on a single ship refusing to die. A ship held together by plates, welds, and the stubborn courage of men who worked until their hands bled. And he would remember how, despite all she had given, the USS Enterprise, the most decorated warship in American history, was eventually sold for scrap. No museum, no monument, just a faded hull cut apart in silence. But Hale knew the truth no scrapyard could erase. Enterprise had lived when everything depended on her, and because she lived, the Pacific War turned. The last image he carried of her was not of her dismantling, but of that first faint sunrise over Iron Bottom Sound, the morning when a wounded carrier emerged from darkness as the single, unwavering line between defeat and victory.